Hey ladies, it's so good to be able to join your community virtually and be able to share a bit. I'm so glad you're still finding community in this time and hearing each other's stories. My story is about my experience during this shelter in place time. As soon as I heard we are going to be doing social isolation, things are shutting down, we got to go home and shelter in place, I made lists. And like a lot of you, I planned to be a stellar baker, and I was going to do a deep clean and write handwritten notes to all my loved ones and clean out all my closets. And then day 2 hit and I was bored. Now, boredom is not a universal truth. I know a lot of you have become homeschool moms and you've had to learn 50 new platforms for getting your work done at home. Some of you have become caretakers from afar and are learning to even grieve with friends and family from a distance. And there's a lot of experiences at this time that are just varied. But one experience is true, that this period of waiting is a little different than other periods because we don't know what the end holds. I can wait at the DMV as long as my number's coming up. I can wait at the airport as long as my flight is coming, but we're not exactly sure what's going to happen at the end. So that made me pause. It made me think. Of the people in the Bible who have followed God closely, and a lot of them were called to wait for interminable amounts of time. Sarah had to wait. Abraham's wife had to wait for that promise of God that she would have a child. She had to wait well into her 90s. And then we have Jonah, one of the great prophets of God, who was running away and got swallowed by a whale and is sitting in the whale's belly waiting to know what God's going to do with him. We have Elijah, who's considered by some to be the greatest prophet of God, who brought kings to their knees with his miracles that he was able to do. And he was told to go to a cave to wait for the voice of God. And Elijah listened through a fire and through a huge storm and an earthquake. And then in silence, he finally heard God's whisper. Now, I don't know about you, but when there's that kind of silence, I turn on Netflix or I throw on some music. I don't have the same experience as you. I live with my dog who does not listen to Frozen 50 times a day. So I do get some opportunities for silence, but I'm not a big fan of silence. But that is how God speaks. He speaks in these times of waiting. And I love the story of Moses as it's told in the New Testament in Acts 7. Moses has such a great story. He's this baby who survives the Hebrew genocide by the Egyptian king. He grows up in the king's palace. He's saved as a baby and becomes a prince of Egypt while his people are slaves. And maybe, if you have kids, you might know Prince of Egypt, the movie that was just so cool, but missed a big chunk of Moses' life. As cool as Moses' life is, he does have a period that's not so cool, and it's that period that I love. So around 40, Moses, is coming into his own. He's a prince. He's rich. He's also a Hebrew man. So he goes to his people. And you can really sense his calling in this. It says he had a desire to know his people, and he wanted them to be free. So he goes and he sees them abused, and he gets angry. And he's filled with rage, and he starts to beat up the Egyptian guard that's abusing his Hebrew brothers. And the guy dies. And so the next day he sees Hebrews fighting. He says, brothers, we have to band together if we're going to be free. And they're like, you're just a murderous guy that can't control his anger. Why would we follow you? And Moses realizes he doesn't have the one thing it takes to be a leader, and that's followers. Moses has literally everything else, but he does not have anybody following him. Now, not only does he not have the buy-in from his Hebrew brothers, but the Egyptians are now after him for killing a guard. So he has to flee to the desert. And this is the part that blows my mind. Moses is in the desert, in his prime, Prince of Egypt, and he goes there, and he has to be there, not for 6 weeks, not for 8 weeks, not for even a year, but 40 years Moses is there. And I can't wait 40 minutes for my DoorDash. Moses is chilling in the desert. Now, we know that Moses isn't bored. He raises kids. He has some sheep. He lives with his in-laws. He's not bored, but he is waiting. He had a calling at 40. He had a passion at 40, and he's doing nothing now. He's doing none of that. He's in the desert. He's far from his people, far from Egypt. And then at 80, when Moses has a speech impediment, when Moses has not that much confidence, very low self-esteem. Moses sees a burning bush and hears the voice of God call to him to lead his people to freedom. Now this blows my mind because the Moses that comes out of that desert at 80 is the only human besides Jesus. He's the only person who can face God, who sees him face to face without dying. He has a special tent set up for him at night where he goes to meet with God and talk to him as a friend. This is Moses who brought one of the greatest powers in history, the whole Egyptian empire, to its knees through plagues by the miracles of God through him. This is the greatest liberator of all time, still remembered thousands of years later. But he didn't reach that until he was 80. He was not there until this long period of waiting that to him had no end at all. And so that's largely how I feel. I feel like this time has no end. And yet I know that over and over in the Bible, God is doing great things in people's lives as they wait. It's really exciting to me to think about what God might be doing. So the next day after, or very shortly after we were sheltered in place, I went on a hike. Now, a lot of you know, if you know me, you know that two things happen to me quite often. I get lost and my phone dies. But not to be frightened, I knew where my car was and I just kept hiking. But things got very quiet after a while. You're not listening to any music and you're just out there in nature. And in that quiet, a lot of my own feelings, a lot of my own thoughts and anxieties kept bubbling to the surface. And I kept giving them to God. And soon I started to getting to the root of where my heart was truly at. I started to hear things from my heart that I hadn't heard in a long time. And in that, I also started to hear from God in a way I hadn't heard him in a long time. And for me, that's a personal experience, but it's very obvious. It's obvious when all of the bubbling anxieties, the to-do lists, the things I've been thinking about for a long time, the problems I'm trying to solve, they kind of dissipate. And suddenly there's thoughts, there's feelings, there's ideas that are coming to mind that don't come from me. And in that time, I felt God asking me to do one thing during this time of waiting, and that was to rebuild my relationship with him in prayer. He asked me to pray a specific prayer, which I did, and he answered that prayer, and it really built up my faith. And I'm not going to share the prayer, but it was so clear to me that God wanted to reignite our relationship in prayer. It was such a blessing. This time of waiting is a blessing. It's very difficult to be in it, but I do know that God is doing something great. And so I just want to encourage each of us, ask God, what might he be doing in this time of waiting? What might he be wanting to say to you? Ask your heart where it's at and ask God what he wants you to know in this time.